Okay, so are you ready to dive into some more this climate resilience blueprint?
Absolutely. I'm fascinated by the approach they're taking, really trying to look at the whole picture.
Yeah, it's not just about like cutting emissions, right? It's about adapting to a world that's already changing.
Exactly. And this whole section on cross-cutting issues, well, it really gets to the heart of how we build a world that doesn't just survive climate change, but thrives.
Right, thrives. I like that. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think the logical starting point is Chapter 11, Policy, Governance, and Legal Frameworks.
Oh, okay, so we're talking about rules, regulations. This is where the rubber meets the road, right?
You could say that it's about moving beyond those kind of vague commitments and actually creating enforceable mechanisms, the kind of stuff that makes sure climate resilience is integrated into, well, every level of government.
So it's not just about having like a climate policy, it's about making it a core part of everything we do.
Exactly, woven into the very fabric of our society.
Okay, but how do we actually make that happen? Because that sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is, and this blueprint, well, it really emphasizes the need for strong leadership, political will, and of course, collaboration across different sectors.
So like if we're talking about, I don't know, a massive infrastructure project like building a new highway or an energy pipeline,
Okay, yeah.
are we saying that climate resilience needs to be factored in like at every stage?
Absolutely. This blueprint is really big on things like climate risk assessments, making them part of those environmental impact assessments that everyone has to do.
So we're talking about a real fundamental shift in how these projects are planned and approved.
Absolutely. And they also talk a lot about nature-based solutions. For example, restoring wetlands as a way to act as a natural buffer against flooding.
Instead of just like building higher seawalls.
Exactly. It's about working with nature, not against it.
Okay, so thinking long term, making sure that the decisions we make today are actually going to make us more resilient in the future.
Exactly. And that brings us to chapter 12, which is all about community engagement and social justice.
Yeah, and this is where things start to get a little bit, well, a little bit uncomfortable. We have to confront the reality that, the people who are most vulnerable to climate change are often the least responsible for it.
That's a very important point. And this chapter really emphasizes that equitable climate action, it requires us to address those existing inequalities. It's about making sure that adaptation strategies don't make those inequalities worse, but actually help to kind of level the playing field.
Right. So it's not just about, say, building a seawall to protect a coastal community. It's about making sure that that community actually has a voice in the process.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's about their needs, their concerns being considered, making sure that the benefits of adaptation are shared fairly.
Okay, but how do we actually make that happen? How do we move beyond just talking about inclusivity and actually create climate solutions that are truly equitable?
Well, the blueprint offers some concrete strategies. One of the big things is participatory planning processes. So you actively involve the community in identifying climate risks, developing solutions, and monitoring the progress along the way.
So it's about shifting power dynamics, giving communities more ownership over their own destinies.
Yeah, and recognizing that different communities have different needs, different vulnerabilities, and different capacities. A one-size-fits-all approach just won't cut it.
Okay, that makes sense. But is there a way to connect those different experiences,
Yeah.
to share knowledge and best practices across communities? I mean, what works for, I don't know, a coastal fishing community might not work for, say, an inland agricultural community.
That's true, and this blueprint talks about the importance of networking and knowledge sharing. Creating platforms where communities can connect, share their experiences, learn from each other's successes and challenges.
It's like creating this collective learning process.
Yeah.
We can all benefit from the wisdom and the innovation that's happening at the grassroots level.
Precisely. And that leads us very nicely into Chapter 13, Indigenous Knowledge and Local Practices. It takes us beyond the kind of standard, I don't know, Western science-based approach to climate change.
Right. It feels like we're finally starting to recognize the incredible value of traditional ecological knowledge, something that's been, overlooked or dismissed for far too long.
Yeah, I agree. And this chapter argues that Western science doesn't have all the answers. Indigenous knowledge systems, they're rooted in a deep, deep understanding of the interconnectedness of nature. They offer really valuable insights into how we can adapt.
Okay, so it's not about like romanticizing the past or rejecting modern science. It's about recognizing that there are multiple ways of knowing and understanding the world.
Exactly. And the potential is enormous when you combine those different knowledge systems.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this is playing out?
Sure. One example is the use of traditional fire management techniques. Many indigenous communities around the world have used controlled burns for centuries.
Right, to manage forest ecosystems, reduce wildfire risk.
Exactly. And now scientists are starting to understand the ecological benefits of these practices.
So it's about Western science learning from indigenous knowledge.
Exactly. And this applies to, well, a wide range of adaptation challenges, from water management to agriculture to disaster preparedness.
It's about listening to the voices that have often been marginalized, recognizing that they hold a wealth of knowledge and experience that can help us build a more just and equitable future.
And that brings us to our last chapter in this section, chapter 14, disaster risk reduction and management.
Oh, okay, this sounds intense.
It can be because it forces us to confront, the increasing frequency and intensity of these climate-related disasters.
Yeah, that's something we can't ignore.
But this chapter, it focuses on a critical shift. It's about moving from a reactive mindset to a proactive one.
Okay, so less about reacting to disasters and more about preventing them in the first place.
Precisely.
But how do you even begin to predict and prepare for something that's, well, unpredictable?
Well, the blueprint emphasizes risk assessments, identifying potential hazards and vulnerabilities, and early warning systems, giving people time to take action.
Right, like if you know a hurricane is coming, you can evacuate.
Exactly.
But what about like a slower onset disaster, like a drought or sea level rise? How do you prepare for something that happens gradually over time?
That's where the long-term planning and adaptation comes in. Things like land use planning to make sure development doesn't happen in high-risk areas, building resilient infrastructure.
So like buildings that can withstand hurricanes, seawalls that can hold back rising tides.
Exactly, and it's not just about physical infrastructure, it's about social infrastructure too.
Mhm.
Building community resilience, making sure people have the knowledge and the resources they need to cope with whatever challenges come their way.
So this is really about a fundamental shift in how we think about, well, how we design and build our world.
Absolutely. This chapter highlights how integrating disaster risk reduction with climate adaptation can create communities that not only withstand shocks, but bounce back stronger.
So this is really about fostering a culture of preparedness,
Mhm.
right? Making sure that risk reduction is woven into every aspect of our society.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but in a good way. We've talked about strong policies, empowered communities, ancient wisdom, proactive planning. It seems like a pretty solid foundation for building a climate-resilient future.
It's a good start, and in the next section, we'll look at how these principles are put into action. We'll dive into specific sectors like urban planning, agriculture, public health.
Okay, I'm ready to see how this blueprint comes to life. But for now, let's all take a deep breath and let this information sink in. It's complex stuff, but understanding it is absolutely crucial if we want to build a world that not only survives climate change, but thrives in the face of it.
Couldn't agree more. See you next time. So, ready to dive into some specific sectors and see how these adaptation principles are actually being put into practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
All right, well, let's start with Chapter 6, urban planning and infrastructure. Cities are often seen as these kind of vulnerable hotspots when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, I can see why. They're so dense, so much concrete, so many people packed into a small space.
Right, but this blueprint flips the script a bit. It actually reframes cities as these hubs of innovation, places where a lot of the solutions are being developed.
Okay, I like that. So what kind of solutions are we talking about? Is it all about like building seawalls and relocating people?
It's more nuanced than that. The blueprint really emphasizes those nature-based solutions, things like restoring wetlands, creating green roofs, using permeable pavements.
So it's about weaving nature back into the urban fabric.
Exactly. And that's not just about aesthetics. These nature-based solutions, well, they have a whole range of benefits. They improve air quality, reduce the urban heat island effect, they enhance biodiversity.
It's like we're finally realizing that we can't just separate ourselves from nature, even in our cities.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just creating new green spaces. This blueprint also talks about retrofitting existing buildings, making them more energy efficient.
And what about transportation? Because that seems like a huge piece of the puzzle when it comes to cities.
Absolutely. The blueprint talks a lot about sustainable transportation systems, reducing reliance on cars, promoting walking, cycling, and public transit.
It's about creating cities that are not only climate resilient, but also, well, just better places to live.
Absolutely. Cities that are healthier, more livable, more vibrant.
Okay, so we've talked about cities, but what about the food we eat?
That brings us to Chapter 7, Agriculture and Food Security. This is a big one because climate change is already having a huge impact on how we grow food.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. So how do we even begin to adapt our agricultural systems to these challenges?
Well, this blueprint takes a multifaceted approach. It talks about diversifying crops, adopting sustainable farming practices, and strengthening local food systems.
So it's not just about one solution, it's about having a whole toolbox of strategies.
Right. And it also emphasizes the need for things like agricultural extension services, providing farmers with the training and support they need to adopt these new practices.
It's about recognizing that farmers are on the front lines of this challenge, and they need our support.
Absolutely. And this chapter also goes beyond the farm gate. It talks about reducing food waste, strengthening storage and distribution systems.
It's about making sure that everyone has access to safe, affordable, and nutritious food, even in a changing climate.
Exactly. Okay, ready to move on to another essential resource?
Hit me with it.
Let's talk about water. Chapter 8, Water Resources Management.
Yeah, that's a big one. And we've already touched on water in the context of cities and agriculture.
True, but this chapter takes a much broader perspective. It's about managing water in a way that balances social, economic, and environmental needs, recognizing that water is fundamental to, well, pretty much everything.
So how do we make sure we have enough water for everyone in a world where the climate is changing?
Well, the blueprint talks a lot about integrated water resources management, thinking about the interconnectedness of water, land, and ecosystems. It's also about things like water conservation and efficiency measures.
Yeah, I know. I could definitely do a better job of conserving water.
Me too. But this chapter goes beyond individual actions. It talks about things like safeguarding water quality, strengthening storage and harvesting techniques, managing flood risks.
It's about thinking holistically and recognizing that the way we've managed water in the past may not work in the future.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that often gets overlooked in these climate discussions: public health.
Okay, Chapter 9, Public Health and Climate Change. This is getting personal.
It is, because climate change is a major public health threat. This chapter looks at the many ways that climate change can impact our health. Everything from heat stress and respiratory illnesses to the spread of infectious diseases.
Okay, I'm getting a little anxious just thinking about it. So how do we protect ourselves from these health risks?
Well, the blueprint talks about strengthening public health surveillance systems, improving access to healthcare, and developing heat action plans.
It's about being proactive, anticipating these risks, and taking steps to protect the most vulnerable.
Exactly. And it also addresses the mental health impacts of climate change, things like anxiety, depression, PTSD.
Right, because climate change is not just a physical threat, it's also a psychological one.
And that brings us to our final chapter in this section, Chapter 10, Economic Resilience and Financing Adaptation.
Okay, the money question.
Mm.
Because we can have all the great ideas in the world, but without funding, it's all just talk.
You said it. This chapter explores the whole world of climate finance, how we actually pay for these adaptations. It talks about public investment, private sector engagement, innovative financing models.
So are we saying that climate resilience needs to be built into every economic decision?
That's the overarching message. It's about recognizing that investing in climate resilience is not just about avoiding losses. It's about creating opportunities for economic growth, for innovation, for a more sustainable future.
Okay, this has been quite a journey through these sector-specific adaptations.
Yeah.
It's clear that we're talking about a major transformation across all sectors of society.
And we're not done yet. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still one crucial piece of the puzzle missing, actually putting it all together and making it happen.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Let's wrap up this deep dive and see how we move from blueprints and strategies to concrete actions and lasting change. Okay, so we've explored the blueprint, we've seen how different sectors are adapting, but now it's time to talk about the moving forward section, right?
Exactly. This is part V. It's all about implementation, about turning these great ideas into tangible results.
All right, I'm all about action. So what's the first step?
Well, Chapter 15 tackles a really important aspect that often gets overlooked: monitoring, reporting, and evaluating adaptation, or MRE for short.
MRE. Okay, I'm sensing a theme here. We've talked about monitoring and evaluation in other chapters too. It seems like it's kind of a fundamental principle of good governance.
You're absolutely right. You can't manage what you don't measure. And with climate adaptation, it's so complex, so long term, you absolutely have to have systems in place to track your progress. See what's working, what's not.
So it's about being strategic, data-driven.
Exactly. Clear objectives, measurable indicators, robust data collection. It's about creating that feedback loop so you can adapt and make course corrections along the way.
And I see the word reporting in there too. Who are we reporting to, and why is that so important?
It's about transparency and accountability. You're communicating your results to all your stakeholders, communities, policymakers, funders, even international organizations.
So it's about building trust and sharing knowledge so we can all learn from each other.
Exactly. And then there's the evaluating part, taking a step back, critically assessing those adaptation efforts, trying to understand why some strategies are working better than others, and, well, identifying areas for improvement.
So it's about continuous learning, recognizing that climate adaptation is an ongoing process.
Precisely. MRE is crucial for that adaptive management approach, being flexible, being responsive, recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Okay, I'm starting to see how MRE fits into the big picture. It's not just about paperwork. It's about using data and feedback to drive better climate action.
Exactly. So now, ready to look ahead a bit to the future of climate resilience.
Let's do it. Chapter 16, Innovation and Future Directions in Climate Adaptation. What's in store for us? Flying cars, underwater cities.
Well, maybe not that futuristic, but this chapter does encourage us to think big, to imagine a future where climate resilience is just woven into everything we do.
Okay, I like that. Thinking big. So what are some of those big ideas?
Well, technology is a big one. We're talking about advances in climate modeling, being able to better predict climate risks. We're talking about climate-smart infrastructure, materials that can withstand extreme weather, even self-heal after being damaged.
It's amazing how technology is changing the game when it comes to adaptation. But it feels like there's a risk of relying too much on tech solutions.
That's a good point. Technology is a tool. It's not a silver bullet.
Right. So what about the social innovations? The changes in how we think and how we govern ourselves?
This chapter talks a lot about that too. New governance models that empower communities, innovative financing mechanisms, and a cultural shift, really embracing this idea that we are all interconnected, that we're part of nature, not separate from it.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about a fundamental shift in our values and our worldview.
Exactly. And this chapter reminds us that sometimes the best innovations come from looking back. Integrating that indigenous knowledge, those local practices that have worked for centuries.
Okay, so we've come full circle. We've explored this climate resilience blueprint from start to finish. What's the takeaway message? What's the one thing you want listeners to remember?
Climate resilience is not just about surviving. It's about thriving. It's about creating a world that is not only ready for climate change, but is also more just, more equitable, and more sustainable. And this blueprint, well, it's a roadmap to get us there. It shows that the solutions exist. Now it's up to all of us to actually put them into action.
That's a powerful message, a call to action for all of us. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something, that you're feeling inspired, maybe even a little bit challenged. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay resilient.